So once I have my sketch done, I begin by using my gray pen, my gray brush pen. This is just a brush pen that I have filled up with one of those two grays. I think right here I'm using the Gris Nuage. And this is sort of an undercoat layer of shadowed areas. And then after that, I start using the black pen and begin to pick out details and things. And what I want for this piece is for the bulk of the foliage in the upper part of this tree to be dark silhouetted, and that will let me showcase the glow of the fireflies. So now without any sort of darkened background, you can't really get that contrast, which is why I had to figure out some kind of composition which would let me have a lot of dark areas that let that light contrast out and show. Now I switch back and forth between filling in that background area and doing the fox, which I also drew with a lighter colored ink. Having these different neutral tones allows me to have some kind of variation in my tone so that I'm not strictly dealing with black and white, although much of it is that. You have to take that into account when you're working with ink. Really think about your shapes and your negative space, because that's going to dictate the composition. But having some grays allows me a degree of freedom from those restrictions. And these little fireflies, or these little sparks, I guess they could be more distant fireflies, I'm doing by slowly working my way around each of those gray splotches that I did in underlayer, with the black overlaying it, and then you won't be able to see the edges of that gray once the black is all filled in around. So I don't need to cover the entire area with gray, I just need to cover the spot around that little bit of light. Here, zooming in a little bit so that you can see better what I'm talking about. And I work in this circular shading fashion around each of these little sparks. Here's a little close-up of one of the fireflies, starting out with sketching it, and then I lay in that gray, and then after that I use my lighter gray pen just to fill in some details on the firefly's body himself, and then slowly shading in the external area. And for the final piece, of course, this melds into the larger black area of the tree. But for this little example, I'm just having it end in this circular formation. I want to talk a little bit about some inking techniques, some things that you could do with line work. So ink is primarily either black or white. That's what scares people sometimes, that there's no in-between shading. But there is actually lots of ways that you accomplish in-between shading with it. You do it via texture. And one of the ways I mentioned with this brush pen and with a rough paper is that you can simply move your brush across the paper quickly, and then you achieve this dry brush shading. Another thing you can do is called hatching. So if you start off with all your strokes parallel and going in the same direction, and then you overlap the previous layer slightly with each successive layer, you can accomplish this shading. And I'm pressing less with each of these layers as I go, so I actually can get even this sense of gradation from dark to light can make this upper area even darker. Now with my Firefly piece, here's a little test drawing that I did. I wanted to have this sense of the inner part being very light and moving out to the darker external area. And so in order to accomplish that, I did, basically it's this hatching technique of shading, where, but instead of being in a straight plane like this, I'm working around the edges of a circle. So in order to do that, I have to start first with the inner circle. And I'm making my lines go parallel outwards. And the next layer. And then the next layer out from there. And one of the things I discover as I work, and it might not be the same for you, it's just the way I handle the brushes, is that when I do a brush stroke using this brush pen, when I do fast ones anyway, like this, I find that I'm much heavier or darker on the starting end of my stroke than on the tail end of my stroke. So you see the top here is kind of a darker bit of ink, and the bottom part is lighter and thinner. So I use that to my advantage when I'm doing a shading like this, where I start, because I want the inner part to be lighter, I start from the outside and move inwards into my circle from all angles as I do this. And once I get a little bit of a base in, then I can lightly go around and start to do more shading like this with my fast moving brush, just to blend things a little bit better and to make it more of a seamless transition. And of course, eventually I would darken my outer edges all the way to complete black. I'm not going to do that currently. Because this paper is rough, there's a lot of dry brush action that happens, as you see. If I want to have my black more solid, one thing you can do is just dip very quickly into water, just like that. Just a little quick dip. And that gives your ink a much more solid look for a temporary bit. So you can do that to really darken black areas. And it'll go back to its normal consistency after a little bit. But that helps to blend out this black outer portion. So that's the technique that I am using on this Firefly piece. And I'm using it on all these little lighter areas, and I will be using it on the actual fireflies themselves. One other thing that you'll notice that I did on my Firefly piece, though, is that instead of starting from white paper, I actually started from initially a blob of gray because I didn't want my center to be bright, bright white. I wanted it actually to be gray. And so I just do this blob of gray, and I let it dry first, because if you don't let it dry, what's going to happen is, just like with watercolor, wet and wet, things will bleed out a little bit when you touch it. So you gotta let that dry, but once it dries, then I start basically doing this same technique around this gray, making sure that
Once I get to the outer edges of this gray blob, I am pretty close to the solid black portion. So this has to be larger than just the central little white dot. It has to be big enough to cover basically this whole area. So that's what I did with both this firefly as well as the lighter sparks on the tree that is in progress. So there is hatching and shading with dry brush. And that's a technique that you can work in if you are also doing some ink work or some brush ink work of your own.
All right, back to the main piece. I'm basically applying that same technique over and over again to all these fireflies. I think there's like 10 of them or something, which for me is a small amount. Sometimes I do 100 of a single creature in one picture. I'm thinking butterflies and stuff. It's amazing. I haven't driven myself crazy doing that. All right, so lots and lots of little fireflies. And I'm using the gray and the white and the black to give myself 3 tiers of light, of contrast, of tone in this. So I want the fireflies themselves, the entire firefly, to sort of have this nimbus of light around them, but not so bright that it eclipses the bright pinpoint of their lit up tail, lit up back end of their abdomen. I don't know what you call it. Anyways, so to that end, I'm doing these circles, these semicircles around the larger fireflies, and then leaving this bright white around the actual lit up portion of them. The circles around them, around the entirety of their bodies, that's more a compositional element because I like the visual of these sort of bubbles of gray, these larger ones, as well as these little tiny ones that spark off to the sides. So this allows me to do that because there's some stylization going on here. And filling in all of this dark area gets a little tedious, but slowly make my way around. Filling in all that stuff. The thing I like about using this paper, I mentioned this at the start, but you can see it in action here, even in these dark black areas where there's a tiny little bit of a mottled, speckled texture to it. And I can fill that in entirely if I want, just by wetting the tip of my brush and letting the ink, which is not waterproof, blend a little bit more. But I like that speckly look, which gives it sort of this little sparking life. In this little section of the tree, I decided to take a chunk out of it just to break up the symmetry. And then it's back to the little fox, which I had previously drawn in with the lighter gray ink in a nib. And now I'm going back in and fleshing it out, really using the black to make the outlines much more pronounced because I want him to show up more. You know, at that point early on, I wasn't quite sure how dark I wanted him and how much contrast there would be against the background. But once I get all the other elements in, I can more accurately judge that. So a lot of this stuff is just sort of happening as I go. I have some ideas planned, like I knew I wanted the large silhouette of the tree, but the exact areas of lights and darks, I don't really plan that out until I have more of the piece filled in, and then I can sort of react as I go and see what's going to work best in terms of the overall composition and what's going to make the piece more striking. You know, things like that little chunk that I took out of the right side of the tree where I broke up the symmetry, which looks like, you know, there's this bite taken out there. And these little fireflies, I'm using the lighter toned gray to do them, just so that they're not completely dark, and it helps them stand out a little bit more against the black of the silhouetted tree. Just a few black highlights on them though, dark lights.